My name is Abigail Burgett, and this is my presentation over Waverly Hills Sanatorium and the trip that we took to Louisville. First off, looking at my reactions. So, behavioral reactions, I noticed that the startle response, mainly when we would all be standing in the hall and the tarps over the windows would start flapping because of the wind. That really would make me jump every time. And also, I have experienced nail biting because I guess just because I was so nervous standing in the groups, and I've always done that, and so it just kind of went back to me when I was nervous and I couldn't control it. Physiological reactions, I experienced an increase of heart rate, especially when we were walking down the hallways to go to one room or another, and it was mainly because I didn't want to see anything out of the peripheral vision. So I would just walk and it would make me anxious of thinking that I'm going to see something. So I would just stare in one spot and I just continue to make myself more anxious, which increased my heart rate. And for psychological reactions, I experienced anxiety just from being in the building and from knowing all the stories about what people had experienced there. It made me nervous of the unknown, I guess. And then I also experienced sadness, which I thought that I would, going into this, I thought that I would be just like extremely frightened, but I wasn't. When I learned about the history of the building and the patients and the people who work there, it just seemed like a really sad place. And then I have a quote here written by psychologists, mobs, and co writers. And it just says the long term survival of the species depends on the ability to learn from and optimally respond to a potential or real threatening stimulus. We therefore propose 5 strategies that are essential to survival: prediction, prevention, threat orienting, threat assessment, and rapid reaction to imminent danger at varying defensive distances. And I included this on my slide of my reactions because it kind of shares how we could have developed these reactions of when we're scared, and it just really they think it goes back to just the long-term survival skills that it takes to live. Then going on to some stimuli that had a noticeable effect on me, the darkness, for one, just being in that old abandoned building, and it being super dark, and especially because it was weird, and our eyes was playing tricks on us, um, because of that darkness. And it was also strange to me that um, some areas of the sanatorium were darker than others, but they were all kind of equally lit. So that was strange to me. And then also the sound of the wind, like I said, it would always catch me off guard and make me jump. And then also the cold weather. And I expected it to be cold, and it was, but what was strange to me was that some floors were colder than others. And it might have been because they had better protection on the windows, but it was still strange to me. Then, looking at the responses of others, I noticed that most people in the group had similar reactions to me, and so I noticed that people would jump at the noises and that they all stayed close to the group. And then I also noticed that we would all kind of stand still when something abnormal occurred. So, like when members were separated from the group and we were all watching them, I noticed that everyone was just staying still, focused on them, instead of kind of looking off into the other rooms. But some of the reactions that were different to mine were that I noticed that people held on to one another when they were scared, and that could be because of the idea that people want to be in social places when they're scared. And then also noticed that some people didn't get scared and that they didn't mind standing alone or being in the back of the group, which was very different to me because I wanted to be kind of in the middle, just so that, because in my head, if something was going to happen, it was going to happen to someone on the edge. So, and now looking at the trip from an empirical point of view, the tour guide definitely used priming during his narration. So like when he was telling us stories of what he's seen or heard, Like when he told us that he had seen a nurse in a white coat, my eyes started telling me that I was seeing a figure in white, and I don't really think I was. I think it was just my eyes playing tricks on me because of what he had said. Then I have another excerpt here by Atom and Higgins, which was cited in Moulton in 2014, and it says that priming effects in social psychology will involve some stimulation of people's mental representations of social targets, events, or situations that then influences subsequent evaluations, judgments, or actions. So basically, when he was telling us those stories about what he has experienced, that's exactly what our mind's going to go to, and we're going to sometimes think that we're experiencing something similar. And then he also used projection during his narration. And what I'm referring to is when he would say, "Did you see that or did you hear that?" And I remember at one time being in the front of the group and he asked if we heard something. And I don't think any of us did, but he kept going with it. And I think he was trying to get us to think that we're hearing something. Moving on to theories. First, we have Darwin. So, Darwin's theory on why certain stimuli elicits from a fearful response suggests that emotions are understood due to evolutionary history in the role of survival. So, Darwin's theory focused on the display of emotion as an operation due to natural selection. And to study this theory, he would observe people and animals, such as cats and dogs. And then here I included a quote from him that says, "We have seen that the study of the theory of expression confirms to a certain limited extent the conclusion that man is derived from some lower animal form." So that quote just kind of backs up his idea of the theory of evolution. And moving on to the Jameson theory, Jameson's theory on why certain stimuli elicit a fearful response suggests that the body is essential to experience emotion. So he kind of paid more attention to the emotional experience instead of the expression of the emotion. And he said, "My thesis on the contrary is that the bodily changes follow directly the perception of the exciting fact, and that our feeling of the same changes as they occur is the emotion." Moving on with theories, we have Seligman. And Seligman's theory on why certain stimuli, like a fearful response, suggests that primates are conditioned to fear stimuli connected to recurrent survival threats. And Seligman did a lot of work with phobias, and he said that they primarily occur to stimuli that are relevant to survival. And his theory would relate to the quote at the beginning of my presentation by Mobbs. They would kind of have the same ideas. But I included a quote here about Seligman's theory, and it says that Seligman's preparedness theory of phobias implies that fear-relevant stimuli are contra-prepared for safety signal conditioning. So what he's saying is that our reaction is a result of what we think is going to keep us safe. So moving on to enjoyment, I did have fun on the trip. I enjoyed the overall suspense of the tour, and I wasn't as scared as I thought I would be. Like I said, a lot of my emotion was just sadness, but I was also very anxious as well. So it was a frightening experience, even though I don't think I experienced anything too scary. But I do think that the priming and projection that the tour guide uses made it a lot scarier than what it would have been without it. And this is because with his stories and stuff, I was expecting something to happen, and I kept waiting on it, and so it kept making me anxious, and the suspense just kept building. And I also enjoyed seeing the old jail, and I think it's cool how they've kind of modernized it, but they've also kept it in its original state in some areas. And I think that's cool, and I wish they had more to share about the history of that, because I thought that was a really neat place. And I do think that my enjoyment was a direct result of being afraid. Even though I wasn't completely frightened, I was afraid of just the not knowing what was going to happen next. Um, so like I said, like while we were on the tour, I was nervous that something unexplainable was going to happen and that it would freak me out. And that's why when we were walking down hallways, I would just stare straight instead of looking off. So now looking at why people enjoy fear. So for some, fear evokes a positive response. And I'm one of those people. I've always loved horror movies and stuff. So we know that fear releases dopamine in the brain, so it makes people feel good. The adrenaline that's produced, and also just the idea of kind of facing something scary when you're in a safe environment is thrilling for some people. So the first quote was written by Carol in the book of The Nature of Horror, and they say that horror is, in large measure, identified with the manifestation of categorically impossible beings. Work of horror, all things being equal, will command our attention, curiosity, and fascination. The fascination with the impossible being outweighs the distress it engenders. So essentially, what they're saying is that the almost like the risk outweighs the that the reward outweighs the risk, and that just us being curious and it drawing our attention and us being fascinated by horror is worth more than the moments of stress that it causes while we're watching it or experiencing it. And this next quote says that the account is integrationist to the extent that it traces the attraction of horror in the emotional experience it elicits, an experience, I argue, that is potentially both beneficial and rewarding, unlike its real life occurrences. So, what they're saying is that the fear of horror media or a safe horror experience is beneficial, which is different from when we're placed into um, life threatening situations that inflict fear. And then the last quote I have here says, "The approach I advocate is pragmatic. Fear is an intervening variable between sets of context dependent stimuli and suites of behavioral response. Its usefulness is explanatory, and one can be agnostic about any correspondence with other psychological, let alone neurobiological states." So, fear is something that we can't live without, and it is connected to a lot of important things, such as behavioral response. I think that people overall enjoy fear because of the reactions that it causes, like increased heart rate or, your stomach churning for a little bit, but then the feeling of pleasure afterwards of like having a sense of accomplishment almost, of having survived something that's scary. Overall, just enjoying fear can also help us navigate the world that we live in because the world is very unpredictable. So when we can experience fear in a safe environment, it can help us um, in situations where we have to face real danger. And here are my references. Thank you.